I got a request video on Facebook from Jamie. So first and foremost, thanks to Jamie for sending me the request. He asked me to discuss Mike Tyson's opponents. I presume he means, the equality of opponents, how good a resume it is, and also how would Mike Tyson have done in a head-to-head matchup with Muhammad Ali. So let me talk that through. I guess the first and foremost, one of the things to say about Mike Tyson is he's one of those guys, in my opinion, who, in terms of the eye test, was a complete wrecking ball of a fighter. When you look at Mike Tyson fights and when you look at him at his prime in the early days, it's easy to get carried away with the eye test, and it's very easy to kind of think that this is a guy who couldn't be beaten at his best. And I think, to be fair, he's a guy who actually wasn't beaten at his best. It's just very unfortunate that Mike Tyson's biggest fights, the fights that are really remembered when we look back in history, the fights against other all-time greats, the likes of Lennox Lewis and Evander Holyfield, he was unsuccessful in. I mean, Tyson did beat an all-time great in Larry Holmes, but obviously that was towards the end of Larry Holmes' tenure as a real top fighter. I believe Larry Holmes had possibly even been retired before that fight. Now, I'm going to be honest, Tyson made his pro debut in 1985. As you may be able to guess, I wasn't actually born in 1985, so I can't say that I followed his early career with too much interest, but I've looked back on it, and I've obviously watched a lot of Mike Tyson fights, and he's someone who I've always found difficult to weigh up because of that sort of difficult combination of a guy looking absolutely fantastic to the eye test, but possibly not having the greatest resume, certainly when you compare him to a Muhammad Ali, or perhaps you could say a Lennox Lewis, or that type of character. But in terms of discussing his resume, I think one of the things to mention, obviously it's a well-known fact that Mike Tyson was the youngest heavyweight champion in history, and one of the reasons for him getting to that position was because he actually had 19 fights in his first year as a professional. He made his pro debut, I believe, in March 1985. And by March 1986, he was stepping into the ring for his 19th time. So amazing momentum and speed. He was clearly well managed. Now, obviously, with that 19 fights in a year, he wasn't in against any great opposition. In fact, whilst I can't claim to have a elite knowledge of heavyweight journeymen in the late 1980s, it would appear, based on what I do know about it, that he was actually in with worse opposition than the likes of an Anthony Joshua or a Hughie Fury or a Joseph Parker at the early stage of his career. But that's, I guess, is understandable given how young he was when he actually turned professional. Outside of that first year, he did start to step it up in terms of level of opposition. He fought Mitch Green, who wasn't a great fighter, but I guess he had the bad blood with Tyson. I remember seeing about Mike Tyson and Mitch Green having a fight on the street and there being a lot of bad blood with them. Perhaps that was a 1980s version of the bad blood between Anthony Joshua and Dillian Whyte. Somebody who was around at the time and no doubt remembers it can comment and let me know. He did fight some decent level opposition on the way up to world title level. Pinkland Thomas is actually an underrated fighter. I know a bit about Pinkland Thomas. I remember reading a big spread about him in Boxing Monthly, probably about 2 years ago now, where they did an in-depth interview with him and a sort of breakdown of his entire career. And I looked up on some of his fights afterwards, and Pinkland Thomas was a good fighter who's largely forgotten about by the modern boxing fan, but he's solid enough. I mean, I don't know who an appropriate comparator would be to the modern heavyweight division. Again, perhaps if somebody is watching from the, who remembers him and remembers watching him at the time, you can comment who you'd compare him to. Certainly in terms of his style, that's where maybe you could give me some input. But I see him as a sort of top 10 heavyweight of the time, a sort of mainstay of the division. So, let me know your thoughts on that. Tony Tucker was another name, and then Mike Tyson took on Larry Holmes. Now, obviously, Larry Holmes goes down as an all-time great heavyweight. Certainly a top 10 all-time great heavyweight. I don't think there's much of an argument to exclude Larry Holmes from outside of the top 10. And Tyson won that fight, as we know. Huge question about how the fight was made. Don King turning up at Larry Holmes' door and talking him out of retirement. How motivated was Larry Holmes? How in condition was Larry Holmes, etc. But regardless, to have Larry Holmes on your resume is a big win, even if it was at the end of your career. I guess then Tyson had his biggest win against Michael Spinks, who really wasn't a heavyweight. Michael Spinks was a guy, he'd made his name moving up to heavyweight, and he'd beaten Larry Holmes himself. Twice, I believe, he'd actually beaten Larry Holmes. So Michael Spinks was a respectable guy. Anyone who beats Larry Holmes twice is I guess you could say, is a legitimate heavyweight, simple as. But, Michael Spinks, I think in terms of his size, had the frame more of a light heavy than a full heavyweight. But as we know, the manner with which Tyson took him out was absolutely devastating. In terms of other wins on his resume, obviously, I think he had 2 wins against Frank Bruno. And for me, there's a lot of wins at that level. Pinkland Thomas, Michael Spinks, Frank Bruno. These were thereabouts world title level fighters. I mean, don't get me wrong, they weren't dominant champions, as we know in the UK with Frank Bruno. I mean, Frank Bruno, if you're talking about where he is as a heavyweight champion, he's not a Vladimir Klitschko, he's more of a Ruslan Chagayev or a Deontay Wilder type champion. He's not the top guy in the sport, that sort of thing. But regardless, it's a very respectable win, and it's also the manner with which Tyson took out his opponents. I mean, in discussing his opposition, I won't talk about the end of his career. By this time, I was watching him when he was fighting Danny Williams and McBride and all of that nonsense. But we certainly have to discuss Evander Holyfield. We have to discuss Lennox Lewis. Unfortunately, he came up short in those fights. By the time he fought Lennox Lewis, he was old. You could see it with Tyson. I mean, even physically, he'd had a hard life. He'd been to prison. He'd had all sorts of difficulties outside of the ring, which are well publicised. But by the time he fought Lennox Lewis, visually you could even see he was an old man. And stylistically, I thought he actually caused Lennox Lewis problems in the first round. But Lennox was in his prime at that stage, whereas Tyson was far past it. And Lennox got the job done in fairly decisive fashion. Obviously, Evander Holyfield, another all-time great heavyweight, he had the fights with Tyson and proved himself to be the better man at that stage of his career. But I think the question always remains for Mike Tyson, whilst his big wins are against an aged Larry Holmes, Spinks at that stage of his career, Tony Tucker and these sort of names, you have to question, would he have ever been beaten at his elite best? Because, when this guy was on form, he was a joy to watch. I guess the other thing to mention is Buster Douglas. I haven't even mentioned Buster Douglas. How do I get to, 9 minutes into a Mike Tyson video and I haven't even mentioned Buster Douglas? But, by the time the Buster Douglas fight came around, certainly when Evander Holyfield and Lennox Lewis came around and, those sort of names, that there were reasons for the loss. I'm not going to say excuses, but reasons for the loss. We know what Tyson was up to, and it wasn't always good stuff. So, to sum up a prime Mike Tyson is very, very hard, because you've got that difficulty. Does he have an all-time great top 10 resume? No. In terms of the eye test, is he an all-time great top 10 heavyweight? Yes. And it's where do you put him? For my money, he's bottom end of the top 10. He's bottom end of the top 10. But on his day, he could give anyone a good fight. And stylistically, he poses a very different problem to most heavyweights. He's got that sort of man, peekaboo style type fighter. I mean, I guess there are elements of like Joe Frazier, David Tua. I was almost going to say Derek Chisora. I'll stop myself from saying that. But what Tyson had is huge athleticism, huge speed. I mean, the speed of his combinations. You see him hitting the bag. The speed and power of that combination was electric. As for how he'd do against Ali, it's a real tough one, because if you watch a peak Tyson when he was destroying people, and if you put that Tyson in with Ali, it's almost hard to envisage anyone beating Tyson, because the other thing about him is he had a great chin, and he's an underrated. Everyone thinks of Tyson as an offensively very gifted fighter, and that's true, but in my mind, this is a guy who's underrated defensively. With Muhammad Ali, though, I know we're onto like hallowed territory now, Tyson versus Ali, but stylistically, I think he probably does have the beating of Tyson. That whole sort of how light he was in his feet, how able he was to move, his ability with the jab, his ability to kind of lean and, fight with his back against the ropes and avoid being hit and counterpunch off the ropes. He'd be the taller, rangier guy as well. It's a difficult one. You'd think that a peak Ali could potentially outpoint a peak Mike Tyson. Of course, Mike Tyson's clearly got a puncher's chance in any fight in history. And Ali, whilst Ali goes down as an all-time great, Ali was dropped in his career. Ali was hurt by Henry Cooper. Mike Tyson is a very, very big puncher, or was a very big puncher, so I say. So I wouldn't rule Mike Tyson out of any fight. He's always got a chance, but you'd have to assume there would be scope for Muhammad Ali to outbox him and to be this superior mover, superior jabber, and beat him in that sense. That's my thoughts. Hope that answers the question, Jamie. Look, apologies if I've done disrespect and said anything sacrilege. I wasn't there at the time, but I've watched a lot of the tapes. I've read a lot about it, and that's my opinions about the career of Mike Tyson. So let me know your thoughts. If you've enjoyed this video, do give me the thumbs up. Do subscribe to the channel for some more boxing content. I've got a few more videos that I'd like everyone to check out, and many thanks for watching.